Hey guys, Xena here. So aside from doing the hero class videos, something else I wanted to do was do some brief videos discussing the neutral minions in the game, because overall the neutral minions are what are going to make up a huge bulk of a lot of your decks. So it's very important to kind of get a feel for which ones are good, which ones are worth the money, or the mana you're going to be spending on getting them out. And there's a huge variety, so what we're going to do is I'm going to break these videos up into smaller chunks. In this video in particular, we're going to cover the 1 through 2 mana cost minions, and there are so many of them, so we're not going to get hugely in depth with them. We're just mainly going to have a brief maybe discussion of each one and whether I think it's a good card or not, some basic things you may be able to do with them. So let's go ahead and jump in here and switch over to crafting mode because there are a few I haven't unlocked yet. Not too many, but there are a few. So the first card we have here is the Wisp. Now, most players will tell you this is an absolutely atrocious card. There's no reason to ever carry it in your decks. And by and large, I would agree with that. There are, however, actually a few things you can do with a Wisp. For example, you could use it against a hunter to trigger a snipe for no mana cost, and all you're losing is that 1/1. You could also theoretically couple it with a buff card, such as Paladin's Blessing of Kings, and then on turn 4 with a Paladin, you could have a 5/5 minion on the field. Now, my argument to that would be, well, I'd rather just have a 4-cost Chillwind Yeti, which almost has the same stats, slightly weaker, but that's only one card you're putting out there instead of using two. So generally, there are some things you can do with Wisp, but overall, it's just not a very good card, and I wouldn't be putting this in my decks unless I had some very specific reason for doing such a thing, such as like I know I'm going to be playing a hunter and I know he runs snipe, so hey, maybe I can throw this out there. It'll cost me no mana to get rid of that snipe when I suspect it's up. But other than that, I wouldn't put this in my decks. Next we have the Abusive Sergeant. Now the Abusive Sergeant works like a Dark Iron Dwarf in that it gives one of your minions a +2 attack for that turn. Of course, it only has a 2/1 as far as stats go, but again, it only costs 1 mana to cast as opposed to the 4 for the Dark Iron Dwarf. Now, I have seen some use for the Abusive Sergeant, especially in very fast aggro decks like the Warlock Murloc deck. Typically decks that aren't based on that kind of fast aggro, getting a lot of cheap minions out, I wouldn't typically use this card. I'd much rather carry something like the Dark Iron Dwarf, because you're going to get that same effect, but you're going to get that kind of chunky 4/4 on the minion board that can actually do something opposed to the 2/1, which mostly is only going to trade at most with a 2-cost minion. So it's a decent card. It really depends on what kind of deck you're running though. Angry Chicken, a 1-cost 1/1 that has an Enrage for a +5 attack. Now, I've actually seen people try to do stuff with this card, and to be honest, most of the time it just doesn't work. Priest especially, they see that +5 attack when it enrages, and they think, well, maybe if I throw some inner fires on there and things like that, and increase its health, I can, get this, crazy chicken running around on the minion board. Unfortunately, 9 times out of 10, that's not going to work out for you. I've seen priests try to do it. It almost always ends in a disaster, and you're throwing a lot of these cards into one minion that it just gets annihilated or silenced. So, don't be that guy. Don't use this in your deck. It's just not a good minion card overall. Now the Argent Squire is kind of interesting. A lot of people don't like the Argent Squire. I actually like it in decks with a hero that can actually do that 1 point of damage, whether it be a rogue or a mage or even a druid. And the reason being is you can play that Argent Squire on the turn 1 and you have that 1/1 with Divine Shield. Now if they play a 2-cost minion, you can always most of them have 2 health, so you could hit it with the Argent Squire. The Argent Squire survives, finish it off with your hero ability, and then next turn you could always Shattered Sun Cleric this, turning it into a 2/2 minion, and then it can trade for a 2-cost 3/2 minion on its own. So there are some things you can do with it. It's just it's one of those minions, like I said, I use it in very specific hero classes and in very specific decks that tend to be more fast aggro based. A lot of people I've heard say this card is very bad. I don't think it is. I think it's average to decent depending on how you're using it with specific heroes and in specific kinds of decks. The Blood Cell Corsair, typically considered a bad card. It's a 1-cost 1/2 that removes 1 durability from your opponent's weapon. It's a nice battle cry, but again, I would much rather just have the 2-cost Acidic Swamp Ooze, which gives you a much bigger minion in the 3/2, and it completely destroys the weapon instead of just removing 1 durability. Also, the Acidic Swamp Ooze, being a 3/2, will trade with most other low-cost minion drops. The Blood Cell Corsair, only doing 1 damage, will not even trade with a 2-cost minion. So, it has a cool battle cry, just not terribly effective, and you can get a better effect using a different minion that only costs 1 mana more. Hungry Crab's kind of an interesting card. It is a 1-cost 1/2, but it has a cool battle cry that when it destroys a Murloc, it gains a +2/+2. Now, if you know you're going to be playing against somebody who runs a Murloc deck, this is a fantastic card, because even if you go on turn 2, if they play a Murloc on turn 1, you could throw out the Hungry Crab, it eats it, and it becomes a 3/3 for 1 mana cost. So it's a very cool card, but again, it's very limited in the situation that you can use it. If the person isn't running Murlocs, then it's completely pointless to have this card in your deck, because at the end of the day, you're just having a 1/1 damage 2 health creature. So very situational. It can be cool if you are playing against someone who has Murlocs, but typically this isn't a card that you're going to want to put in your deck unless you know specifically against the kind of decks you're going to be playing. The Leper Gnome is, most people consider a bad card. I consider it a slightly below average to okay card. The Leper Gnome is okay, especially in decks like the Warlock Murloc deck, because you're getting at least that 2 damage to the enemy hero, even if he trades out for another minion before he gets a chance to hit the enemy hero. And in a lot of decks like that, where the focus is on doing as much damage as quickly to the enemy hero as possible, then a card like this can have some beneficial effect, because you're getting at least that minimum guaranteed 2 damage against the hero, and he's probably going to have to trade it for something else. A lot of times if you play this, you can get 2 to 4 damage in on the hero, and sometimes have to trade it for another minion, or he'll trade it for another minion, or he'll hit it himself with a hero ability, and if it's a rogue or it's a druid, he's still going to take that 2 damage and then another 2 damage. So again, very situational to the kind of decks you're playing. If you're playing this kind of deck where your focus is to put everything on the hero's face, like the Murloc deck, or like the Charge Hunter deck that's making its way through Constructed right now, this isn't necessarily a bad card. The Light Warden, generally, again, considered a weaker, bad, kind of bad card. It's a 1-cost for 1/2 that gains +2 attack whenever a character is healed. Now, there is one little trick I like doing with this card if I have it in a priest deck, and I will sometimes pick this in arena if there's nothing better when I'm playing a priest. And that is because you can play this on turn 1, then attack the enemy with it, and actually then on turn 2, if you have nothing else to play, then heal that enemy, and it will give this a 2 attack, turning it into a 3/2. So yeah, you're healing that 1 damage you did, but in return you're gaining a 3/2. So that's kind of a cute little trick you can do with it. Other than that, I don't see a lot of utility with this card outside of Priest, just because of the fact that Priests are the only class that have that hero ability that can heal. So you're not going to see a lot of usefulness in a lot of heroes with this card. So keep that in mind. Outside of a priest, I wouldn't really put this in any of my decks. So we'll move on here to the next page. Now, I'm not going to be talking a lot in depth about Murlocs, because I'm going to cover it a little bit more when I get to the Warlock Hero class, because one of my decks that I'm using right now is the, I believe it's called the Beef Stew Murloc deck. Mine's slightly different, but the gist of the deck is the same. I can basically just tell you, outside of very specifically constructed Murloc decks, do not take Murloc cards. unless you're in arena and it's the only thing of value in the card selection between the three choices. Um, Very rarely in arena I will take something like a Bluegill Warrior, which is the 2/1 with charge, because then I can at least guarantee I can take out like a 2-cost drop with that. But overall, Murlocs on their own in a deck without that Murloc synergy just typically aren't that great. They're not something that I would put in my deck unless I'm building a very specific deck with that synergy. So we're not going to talk too much about the Murlocs when I come across them. Just keep that in mind. Outside of very specific decks where they work together in conjunction, they're just not great cards, and there's almost always a better option to put in your deck. Secret Keeper is an interesting card. For 1 mana cost, you get a 1/2 minion that whenever you play a secret whenever a secret is played, I should say, you gain a +1/+1 to the Secret Keeper. Now, I've actually seen some instances where Secret Keepers can be kind of used in cool situations, especially in such decks as like a Paladin, where its hero secrets are very low cost, so you can actually get them out pretty quickly if you have several of them for low mana. Outside of those specific kind of situations, though, Secret Keeper just generally isn't a good card. And the reason being, even in a Paladin deck, it's not that great of a card, is because overall, secrets just aren't that great. And the reason being they aren't that great is that they're too easy to figure out what they're going to be. And most experienced players know how to get around those. And if you play this without getting any secrets out, one, you're basically telling your opponent in advance, hey, I've got secrets in my deck, and they're going to try to take this out before you can even get a chance to really buff it up too much. At most, maybe on the turn 1, you could play this with a Paladin, put it out and get a secret and get it buffed up to a 2/3 on turn 1 with a coin. Then maybe with something like Get Down or something. So there are some things you can do with it, but just generally, it feels too gimmicky to me. I'd rather build a more solid, cohesive deck that doesn't rely on me not only getting this card, but secrets and like coins and things like that all in the beginning hands. So overall, I really don't run Secret Keeper. I wouldn't recommend it too much unless you just want to kind of play around with a specific style of deck or something. Shieldbearer is a 1-cost 0/4, generally considered a really bad card. I tend to agree with that. It's just not a very good card. There's better things I'd put out there for 1 mana cost, like a Stealth Worgen with 2/1 stats. Shieldbearer is basically just maybe buying you a turn of not getting hit by a low-cost minion. But at the end of the day, it's just not doing anything. It's just taking it to the face for you for a turn at the beginning of a game. You could always buff this up with something if it survives, but again, what's the point? You're much better off picking better cards out there. Again, most players consider this a bad card. I consider it a bad card. You shouldn't be putting this in your decks. Southsea Deckhand is a 1-cost 2/1 with charge. Now, I actually like using this card in a specific situation, and that is with Paladins. Most people will tell you this is a bad card, and generally it probably is kind of a bad card. But there is one circumstance, and I actually like using these, and that is a Paladin deck with the Sword of Justice. And that is because when you play this with the Sword of Justice, that 1-cost Southsea Deckhand becomes a 3/2 with charge. So it's a lot of fun when you're doing that. I've actually won some games with Southsea Deckhands when I had the Sword of Justice out, and I kind of wish I could have seen the opponent's face when I played him. So, there are very specific circumstances which I actually like this card, but overall it's not something, outside of those very specific circumstances that you're going to want to be carrying this card. It's generally not that great. The Worgen Infiltrator, in my opinion, is probably the best 1-mana drop card in the game. On turn 1, you can play this out, and you have a 2/1 with Stealth, which can't be taken out by hero abilities, which is what makes it so good. And then you can then trade this for most 2-cost drops. So I really like this card. I think it's a very good 1-mana cost card. I typically play it in my rogue decks. When I do have some of these fast attack aggro rogue decks, because it fits in not only thematically with the stealth, but it's just a good solid card. I like Worgen Infiltrator. I think it's very worthwhile to put in your decks. Young Dragonhawk is a 1/1 with 1, and it kind of ability is Wind Fury, which means it can attack twice in a turn. Now, Young Dragonhawk, by and large, is considered a very bad card, and that's because with that 1 health, if you play this on turn 1, a rogue or a druid or a mage, they're just going to take it out with their hero ability. Later on, there may be some synergy with this card in Hunter decks because it is a beast, being able to buff it up and whatnot. But overall, Young Dragonhawk's just considered a bad card. It used to be one of the cards that you've seen prominently in a lot of the old one-turn kill Hunter decks, but nowadays you just don't see a lot of it. Overall, just not a great card, and especially outside of those beast kind of Hunter synergy decks, it's just not that great, and I wouldn't put this in my decks. Young Priestess kind of has a cool effect. It's basically a higher stat version of the Blood Imp now, and that is at the end of your turn it gives another random friendly minion plus 1 health. And Young Priestess is nice, but the reason why the Blood Imp arguably is maybe on par with this, or maybe even slightly better still, even that it lost its attack and it only does the 1 health to 1 minion, is that it does have that stealth to hide out and be able to trigger that ability every turn. So you're going to need some kind of AoE or betrayal or something to take it out. The Young Priestess suffers because even if you get this out on turn 1 and coin out even another 1-cost minion, a lot of times you're only going to get that effect for that 1 turn, because most of the classes that have the hero ability, they're just going to take this out, with the mage, the druid, the rogue. So it's very limited in how often you're going to get to be able to use this ability on your minions. Now, this is a card that you see in the Murloc Warlock deck, and one of the situations where it benefits in that is because the Warlock deck has the cheap Voidwalker taunts. So now if you can get this out behind a Voidwalker, it gives it some protection to help keep it alive. Again, a mage is going to be able to ping it off, but a rogue or a druid is then going to have to go through that taunt first to get to it. So it's a little more versatile if you can put it behind a cheap taunt. But other than that, there's just not a lot of use for this card. You're better off with some of the other minion options. And outside of those decks, this isn't a card I typically run very much. Now we're getting into the 2-cost cards. The first one here is Amani Berserker. I actually really like this card, and for some reason a lot of players have the opinion that this is a bad card, and I actually think it's a terrific 2-cost card. And the reason being is that it has 3 health. So a lot of the 1-drop cards, this is going to kill that survive, and it's also going to become a 5/1. So at most, or at least I should say, you're probably going to be getting a 2-for-1 trade on this. And even if, at the worst situation, if they put out a 2-cost minion, what's this going to trade 1-for-1? So ideally, if they play a 1-cost minion, you're probably going to get a 2-for-1 trade. If they don't, you're going to get at least for a 1-for-1 trade. And if they do play that 1-cost minion and you kill it with this, you're getting a 5/1 with at least the possibility of being able to trade up for an even higher minion. So there are some things you can do with this. I actually really like this card. I think it's very undervalued, and I don't really know why it kind of got that bad reputation. The only thing to keep in mind with it is, like a lot of 2-drop cards, because of their abilities, they do tend to get focus fired. People will frostbolt them and look to remove them with Wrath and stuff like that. But overall, I think it's a solid 2-cost card, and I use it in a lot of my warrior decks and whatnot. Ancient Watcher is kind of an interesting card. It is a 2-cost card with 4 or 5 stats, and you're thinking, oh, that's great stats, but the problem with the Ancient Watcher is that he can't attack. So there are 2 things you can do with the Ancient Watcher. First, you can silence him and turn him into a basic 4/5, or a Chillwind Yeti. The other thing you can do with the Ancient Watcher, and a lot of druids will do this in their decks, is that they'll run a couple Ancient Watchers, and then they'll run something like the Sun Fury Protector. So they'll put these down, put a Sun Fury Protector down, and then you have 2/4/5s with Taunt, which initially costs you very little to get out. So it's very situational to use this card. You have to have the cards to go with it, be they Silence or Taunt giving cards, to make the most out of this. And that's one of the inherent problems with it, because you do have to have that card combo to make this a Vinny worth whatsoever. In Arena, I would typically not pick these cards unless I already have the cards to go with them. Definitely don't pick this up before you have something like a Sun Fury Protector, or even then, if you do have that Sun Fury Protector or the Silences, you're relying on drawing both of those cards to be able to make this of any use. So, something in a Druid deck where you're typically going to have several Silences anyways, with the 4-cost 2/4s that can do Silence. You have a little bit more option-wise to be able to activate these cards, but overall, this is not something I would put in my deck unless I had specific ideas for the deck constructions to make the most of them. Bloodmage Thalnos is actually a legendary that I haven't unlocked yet, and I have used him a little bit in Arena. He's a 2-cost 1/1 that adds 1+ spell damage, and when he dies, he draws a card. This is a very popular card in a lot of high-end decks, and it's because it has that little bit of versatility of giving you that extra spell damage and that death rattle of drawing a card, which is very good. Stat-wise, not great. He's not going to do much of anything. It's mainly for that spell damage and the card draw that you can get from him. Other than that, he's not a bad minion to put in your deck. I haven't played with him enough in Constructed to know whether he's worthwhile or not, but a lot of the top tier players in Constructed apparently think he is. So I can't say too much about that until I play with him more in Constructed, but overall he seems like a fairly solid minion for what he does and what he can bring to the field for his mana cost. The Bloodcell Raider, I actually really like this card in certain decks. It's a 2-cost 2/3 with a battle cry that it gains attack equal to the attack of your weapon. So this is a very good card for things like rogue decks that carry a lot of weapons, warrior decks that carry a lot of weapons. If I play a Fiery War Axe and then play this card, well, I'm getting a 5/3 for 2 mana. Typically, I find a lot of times when you play this card, you get that kind of 5/3 out there, but then it would almost automatically kind of get direct damaged. They'll tend to use things like Wrath or Frostbolt to get rid of it. I've even had mages throw fireballs at these guys because that early on 5/3 can be a little intimidating. It's one of those things where you have to have the combo to kind of make it work in your favor. With rogues, you're at least getting that 1/2 weapon, so you're at minimum you're getting a 3/3 creature with this, with a rogue with your default hero ability weapon out. So a 2-cost 3/3 isn't bad by any means, but this can be made a lot better with weapons. Like a lot of the pirates, they just tend to be better with weapons. If you're not running a weapons deck, I wouldn't carry this card at all. There are better options. But if you are carrying a weapons heavy deck, you might look into carrying these cards. Overall, they can be pretty solid to very good in those kinds of constructed decks. Crazed Alchemist is kind of an interesting card. It is a 2-cost 2/2 with a battle cry that it swaps the attack and the health of a minion. Now, this can be actually pretty cool. You could turn like a 2/4 into a 4/2 and then use something that does 2 damage to it to kill it off. And so on and so forth, even up to much higher stats. The problem with the Crazed Alchemist is a lot of time it's just very situational and as to when it's going to be a good opportunity to use him. And I've picked him up a couple times in Arena where there just really wasn't too much better to pick from. And a lot of times, you might have that rare instance where you can do something really cool with him. But a lot of times you'll find out you're just kind of holding on to him, and just nothing really presents itself. And finally, towards the end of the game, I just throw him out as a 2/2. and maybe reverse the health on something in mine to get a little extra damage or something. It's just too situational for me to be a card that you can use effectively in a lot of decks. There are some very cool things you can do with him, don't get me wrong. It's just tends to be, like I said, very situational. The 2-cost 2/2 Dire Wolf, it's a solid to decent card. It gives adjacent minions to the left and right of it +1 attack. I tend to more consider this a better deck or a better card for hunter decks because of that beast synergy that they can benefit from. I have used these in Arena. It's not a bad 2-cost card compared to some of the other ones, so you can make some use of this. Generally, I consider it a decent card. If I'm presented with this, like I said, and there are worse options, I will take it. But overall, I'm mainly looking to put this in kind of a beast decks where it can at least gain that little extra benefit from the beast synergy. Outside of hunter decks, I typically don't run this card. I don't see a lot of reason to. There are better things I'd rather put in there for that 2-cost. Doomsayer is a card I haven't unlocked yet. I've seen it used at the start of your turn, destroy all minions. The interesting thing with Doomsayer is that I've seen it used a lot in late game decks. And it's used to basically combat some of these early aggro decks where they get some of these really cheap minions out early on and you don't have anything to play. So they'll throw out a Doomsayer to kind of cock block those minions a little bit. And most people early on, they'll have a trouble doing that high health of 7 damage to kill this before it destroys all your minions on the next turn. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't work out too well. I've had people play this against me, and I managed to squeeze out that 7 mana and kill it off, and then save my minions for the next turn. So, there is some use for this card in very specific decks. I don't see it being played very often, once in a while. Outside of those very specific decks where you're looking to more control the early game rather than play a lot of minions, this might be something you want to consider. Other than that, I just don't see a lot of use for it in most average decks. Fairy Dragon is a 2-cost 3/2. Very basic, common stats for a 2-cost card. The cool thing with the Fairy Dragon is it can't be targeted by spells or hero powers. Now, the hero powers there is a little misleading because a druid can hit this with his attack. A rogue can hit this with his daggers. What it can't be done, though, is a mage can't ping it, for example, and they also can't target it with a removal spell like Frostbolt or Wrath or a Swipe or something like that. Now, it can be the target of the AoE damage from a swipe. It just can't be the initial target of that swipe. Now, Fairy Dragon I actually like, especially when playing against mages, because they often have a hard time dealing with that initial inability to remove this through either their hero ability or a spell, especially a lot of late game or kind of Pyroblast themed decks that don't rely a lot on early minions to do a lot of damage or removal. They tend to rely on spells. So when you get these Fairy Dragons out and they can't deal with that early on, it could be kind of a pain for them. I've had a few instances where I was playing a mage and I put out 2 Fairy Dragons early on and they just quit on me because they was kind of annoyed with that and they couldn't deal with it. So I think, in very specific circumstances, Fairy Dragon is very good. Even outside of those circumstances, its ability makes it, pretty useful. Ironbeak Owl is an okay drop. For the 2-cost, you're basically just getting a silence. You're also getting that 2/1 minion, but because of that 1 health, it's going to be easily removed by most hero abilities that can do that direct damage. So basically, you're almost paying just for that silence. Now, I'd much rather carry Spellbreakers in my decks because you're getting that 4/3 instead of a 2/1. It's 2 more mana cost, but again, I'd rather have the bigger, beefier minion for the 4 mana cost. There may be some more of an argument to be able to carry these in Hunters because of that beast synergy. But again, even in Hunter decks, these aren't typically going to be a great card, although, because of that beast synergy, when you play this, you will at least, with like a Starving Buzzard, you can get some card draw and the silence. So it's one of those things that really depends on what you favor and what kind of deck you're building, whether it be a hunter. But again, I prefer the spell breakers because you get that silence effect and you're getting a much better minion on the board. Knife Juggler is a very good card. I like it. It's one of my more favorite 2 mana drop cards. It has the stats we're talking about, which is typical for these cards, which is 3/2. And with the Knife Juggler, after you summon a minion, you deal 1 damage to a random enemy. Now, Knife Jugglers to me tend to excel better in decks that play a lot of low-cost, fast, kind of aggro minion decks. Especially something like the Rogue, and I also like these in a Paladin because the Paladin's recruit ability actually will trigger the Knife Juggler. Knife Jugglers can be used to do a lot of things, from just pinging off low 1 health minions that may be left on the board across from you. They're also great sometimes at knocking off those divine shields. I really like these minions. The only downside to them is that, like some of the other 2-cost minions, these tend to get focus fired pretty early on. Mages will tend to frostbolt them or wrath them to get them removed. So you can't always expect this to be out the next turn after you play it, because a lot of times that will happen. But overall, it's a very solid 2-cost minion. I really like them, and they're better, like I said, in decks that either play a lot of minions or even Paladin decks, because they have that recruit ability, which will trigger the Knife Juggler. The Loot Hoarder is a pretty solid card. It's a 2-cost 2/1 with the death rattle of that when it dies, it will draw you a card. So, it has lesser stats than most 2-drops, but again, that 2/1, it'll trade with most other 2-drop cards, and you get that card draw out of it, which is its main kind of point of interest for carrying this card. Overall, it's a very solid card. You see a lot of these being played. I like to have them in my decks to get that quick early card draw. They tend to be, they used to be ran with the, was the kind of counterpart to that card, which I'm trying to remember the name of it. I'm not seeing it here. Let me look over real quick. Yeah, there we go. The Novice Engineer. People used to run 2 of those and 2 of the Novice Engineers, but because of the recent nerf to the Novice Engineers, which knocked its stats down from a 1/2 to a 1/1, Novice Engineers just aren't considered a very good card anymore. You don't see them being run. In most of the decks that I had them, I replaced them with another 2-cost drop. But I typically did keep the Loot Hoarder. So Loot Hoarder is a much better card than the Novice Engineer now, because it can do that 2 damage and it can take out some of the other 2-drop cards. The Novice Engineer just can't do that now because of the stats on it, and it can't even survive a hero ability, which is what downgraded it even more, in my opinion. So Mad Bomber is actually a fun card. But the problem with the Mad Bomber is it has that RNG effect. It's a 2-cost 3/2 that deals 3 damage to randomly split minions or the enemy hero, or even your hero or your minions. It can basically hit anything on the board. There are very specific situations in which you should play the Mad Bomber. Obviously, if you have 2 or 3 1-health minions left, you don't want to play the Mad Bomber, because you're very likely to kill off your minions. If you don't have anything else, or if you have only a big kind of beefy minion out that's not going to die to this, and he has some low health minions out, or something with Divine Shield that you want to get rid of, the Mad Bomber can sometimes do that. But again, you're relying on the RNG effect, and there are certain ways that you can kind of play this in situations that will increase your odds of it doing what you want it to do. But overall, you can't ever really plan on it working out your way. You can just hope that it does. Sometimes you're going to play this card and it's going to hit you 3 times in the face, or it's going to hit the enemy 3 times in the face, or it's going to do exactly what you wanted it to do. You just don't really know. Mana Addict is a 2-cost 1/3. Whenever you cast a spell, gain +2 attack this turn. I see a lot of mages trying to play with these cards, but generally it's just not a great card. and the reason being is that +2 attack isn't persistent. When you play this out on turn 2, or even if you coin it out, or if you play it on 2 and then coin some kind of like arcane missiles or something cheap like an arcane blast, you're just not going to be getting a lot of effect out of it, especially that initial turn. So, because obviously you can attack with that turn that you play it. Most players will then just turn around and just kill this off with either some removal or something like that. So it's just, I think it would be a little bit better if they switched this card to make it more of a persistent effect like the Mana Worm. But even then, they might have to tweak the stats so it's not too much like the Mana Worm. But as it is right now, I just don't think this is a great card. And if you don't play a spell when you have this card out, you're basically just left there with a 1/3 that can't do a whole lot. So not a great card. I wouldn't run this. I don't use it in my mage decks. I don't see a lot of people using it. So overall, not a great card. Mana Wrath is a 2-cost 2/2. All minions cost 1 more for yourself and for the enemy. I've seen this used in very specific circumstances to try to delay the early game a little bit in some kind of decks. Typically this isn't a great card though. It's very easily killed, even by some of the by the 1-drop cards, by the 1 mana drop cards. Just not a great card. There are better things to be playing in your deck for that 2 mana cost that can be a lot more effective and can do a lot more. I wouldn't put this in my decks. Okay, the next card we're going to talk about here is the Master Swordsmith. He is a 2-cost 1/3, and at the end of your turn, he gives another random friendly minion +1 attack. I've seen a few instances of this being okay to use, but generally it's considered a bad card. I just don't use it in a lot of my decks. It kind of suffers from that problem of, it's more of a support card where it actually can't do a whole lot on its own because of that 1 attack. Generally, like I said, just not a great card. You don't see this being ran very often, and outside of very specific kind of deck builds, I would never put this in one of my decks. Murloc Tidehunters, like I said, we're not going to talk too much about the Murlocs because outside of Murloc synergy decks, they're just not considered very good decks, or very good cards, I should say. Novice Engineer, we already kind of just briefly talked about that. It's not considered a very good card anymore because of that recent nerf. Most people don't run this card anymore. It's just too easy to be removed, and you're much better putting the Loot Hoarders in your deck. I wouldn't use this card anymore. I've removed them from all my decks, like I said. River Crocodilus is a 2-cost 2/3. Outside of Hunter decks, I wouldn't use this card just because there are better options for that 2 mana cost. In Hunter decks, you might have a little more versatility with this because it is a beast. The one thing going for the River Crocodilus is that 3 health, so it will kill off most 1 mana drop cards. But other than that, not a great card. I would call it average at best. Sunfury Protector, you can do kind of some cool things with Sunfury Protector. It basically gives the minions onto the left and right of it taunt. We already talked about what you can do with this card with the Ancient Watchers. Sometimes it's worth carrying this card if you just want to get some taunt up at some point in the game to kind of save you from getting hit or to protect one of your minions. Personally, I would much rather have the 4 mana cost Defender of Argus in my deck. It basically has the same effect as the Sunfury Protector, but it also gives each one of those minions on the left and right a +1/+1. So yeah, it costs 2 more mana, but you're getting that kind of premium effect with it for that extra 2 mana. Typically, like I said, I'd rather carry those than this card. Brewmaster card, this is the lower stat of the 2 Brewmaster cards. The other one is the Ancient Brewmaster, which I believe is a 5/4. The Brewmaster has a cool battle cry in which that when you play it, it returns a friendly minion from the battlefield to your hand. So there are some cool things you can do with this, especially with like card draw minions. Minions that have Divine Shield, you can bounce them back and then replay them with a new Divine Shield. So there are some cool things you can do with this. And, presented with this in Arena, if the other cards that I get typically aren't that great, I will take a Youthful Brewmaster because even if at the end of the day I don't get to use its battle cry very well, it's still a 2 mana 3/2, which is solid enough. for an early stage of minion, just to get something out there, especially if you're lacking 2-drops in your arena build. And that should be the rest of, or I should say, the last of the 2-cost minion drops. There are a few I don't have that I will cover here. Let's look them up. Wild Pyromancer is actually a fantastic card, especially used in certain decks. You've been seeing a lot of it being used lately, especially at the higher tiers of Construct. I'm losing my voice a little bit, sorry about that. And Wild Pyromancer, what it does is that after you cast a spell, deal 1 damage to all minions. So you can actually do some really cool stuff with this, especially combined with some other AoE kind of damage abilities like Consecrate. So you can actually do 3 damage instead of 2 damage because of the Wild Pyromancer's triggerable ability. The only thing I would say with Wild Pyromancer is be very cautious of when you play this, because that 1 damage hits all minions, including yours. I've seen people play these, and then without thinking, the next turn they go to play a spell, and they end up killing one of their minions because they forget they have this on the field. So if you're going to run Wild Pyromancers, you can do some cool stuff with them. I actually like these minions. Just be always aware of the situation you're in when you're using them, especially when you've already played them like the turn before or something, because they can have some negative effects for your minions. Nat Peggle is legendary that you're being seeing a lot in a lot of the high-end constructed decks. The reason why you're seeing him a lot more now than what you used to is that there was actually a bug with Nat Peggle, and that bug is that he wasn't drawing the cards 50% of the time like he was supposed to. Now they've actually fixed that, and he draws that card properly now 50% of the time. So that's a very powerful ability, especially for a 2-cost card that has 4 health, because he's very hard to get rid of early on. So you can actually get some of that very fast early card draw. Makes him very good. He's very popular. Overall, a very solid card, and you can't really go wrong with him in a lot of decks. Last one we'll cover here is the Pint-Sized Summoner. It's a 2-cost 2/2. I actually like pint-sized summoners. They're kind of situational, but if you can get these out early on, what that's going to allow you to have is that extra little boost against your opponent every turn and getting a more expensive minion out than he can. Typically, though, the unfortunate thing with the pint-sized summoners is because they have that 2 health, they tend to be killed off very fast. So most experienced players know that, this isn't something I want to leave alive, because if I do, he is going to have that minion to mana advantage on me every turn. So I need to take this out pretty quickly. So usually she gets off, killed off pretty fast, but overall it's a decent minion, and if you can get her out and keep her alive, she can have a lot of a really good bonus effect for your turns thereon after. So those are mostly the early cards, the early 1 and 2 mana drop cards. We'll cover some of the more expensive cards in other videos, but I'm going to go ahead and end that here because I'm losing my voice a little bit, and I'll talk to you guys later. Thank you.